Hi guys, welcome back aboard Athena, my Warrior 38 sailboat from 1987. A few days ago I got done putting down the next new section of foam here in the deck, and the new foam is there to replace the old core in the sandwich construction, which was soaking wet and partially delaminated. If I just go ahead and remove the little bit of weight I've got here on top of the new foam, we should be able to see some spiffy looking new core. Ta-da! A new awesome looking section of foam. In my last video I showed you how much the bottom skin of the sandwich flexed without any foam on there. Now this is how much the deck flexes with just the new foam on there. There's no top skin on here yet. I am putting almost all of my weight on there, and it does flex a little bit, but not a lot. That in combination with some awesome, very reassuring comments I got on my last video now have me convinced that in about a month, when I've applied the new top skin to the deck, I'll be left with a deck that's rock solid. To give you guys an idea of the progress I've made so far, I have now removed way over half of the old core. The strip I'm sitting on here is going to be the very last thing to go. The next section of core I'm going to be removing is going to be the side decks. I've decided to do it that way because I want to give myself a platform to work from while I'm dealing with this joint here, the joint between the deck and the cabin top. As you can see, there is a bit of plywood in there, and I think that has a lot to do with how they constructed the deck, because I think they built the cabin top separate from the deck and then lowered that in. But we'll get back to this joint a little later in the video because I haven't fully decided on what I'm gonna do here yet. I've decided to use plywood rather than foam here in the core and the side decks. There are a couple of reasons for that. For one, by using plywood, it'll be super easy for me to come in at a later date and add tracks to use for the jib sheets rather than using the old solution of attaching blocks to the tow rail. By doing that, I should slightly improve the sailing characteristic of Athena. As you can see, the side decks don't really have any kind of curve to them, so putting down the plywood should be super easy. And by using plywood as a coring material, I'll have the option of adding those tracks I just mentioned at a later date without having to worry about reinforcing the deck. There's also a benefit in the fact that I'll be able to walk on the plywood as soon as I've put it down. And also, if I add the tracks here, I won't have to worry about the strength of the new tow rail versus the old tow rail. I've already ordered the plywood I'll use for the side decks. It's a relatively small area, so it wasn't that expensive. And as a small teaser, I can mention that the plywood I've ordered isn't sold as BS 1088, but it does meet and exceed that standard. But we'll get back to that plywood as soon as it shows up. On my to-do list for today is to build the mahogany frames that's gonna sit on top of the plywood frames you guys saw me put in last weekend as supports for the two new hatches up on deck. And as any cooking show worth its salt, I've gone ahead and done a little bit of prep work. After work yesterday, I swung by the boat and I built these two bases for the mahogany frames. What I did was pretty straightforward. I just cut a bunch of 45-degree angles, applied some thickened epoxy, made sure the frame was nice and square before securing it to this piece of scrap plywood with some screws. The frames are going to be made up of 2 layers of this mahogany, which is, by the way, leftover from the wooden slats I put up aboard Obelix about 2 years ago. This is the hatch that's going to sit on top of this frame, and here in the corners of the frame I want to have nice rounded corners that's going to match the curvature of this. This is actually a piece I've got left over from the first hatch I built, but the radius here should be the same. So yeah, that looks like a good fit to me. So I'm going to need to cut 4 of these little rounded doohickeys here for each frame. And sure, that's a little bit fiddly, but there's a trick to these. The difficult part here is lining up the mahogany just right, because we don't want to waste this. It is rather expensive, but once you've lined it up, it's just a matter of, there we go. Now don't be upset if you get this wrong the first couple of times. It's pretty difficult to pull off, especially with hardwood. Now that I've got these 4 doohickeys here cut and all lined up, all I need to do is to cut the pieces that go here, as well as the outer parts of the corners. With all the pieces cut for the frame, it's gonna look a little something like this. I know it literally looks a little rough around the edges, but those edges are gonna get trimmed later on. And here's the frame, all gooped up in thickened epoxy. I've sadly run out of time for today, so I won't be finishing the second frame, but I've got some time tomorrow, and both of the frames should be ready for this weekend. Good morning, guys. It's Saturday morning. Yesterday afternoon, after getting off from work, I swung by the boat and I glued up the second frame. I know it looks like a big globby mess right now, but once sanded, it should clean up real nice. The second frame looks to be okay. It is certainly nice and flat. Yesterday, while checking the first frame, I noticed something that means I might have to build a new frame, and that's this little nibble over here. Now, I like nibbles as much as the next guy, but this one is a bit disconcerting because I think this means the frame was warped when I screwed it down. I'm assuming this piece of plywood is reasonably flat, so let's see. Yeah, that frame is a little bit warped. It's certainly not flat. I'd say that's about 4 or 5 millimeters. I'm going to clean this up real quick just to get a better look at how bad that warping is. Of course, the definitive test to see if I can use my 2 new wooden frames is simply just to take the aluminum frames in the hatch and check what kind of gap is there. These are only there for transport purposes, so I can go ahead and remove these and I should have a nice flat aluminum frame. This is the second of the 2 wooden frames, and as you can see, the aluminum frame sits in there perfect. There's absolutely no gaps. Over here we've got the first frame, the one that's just had that nipple-dectomy, and yeah, there is a sizable gap there. Considering the fact that it only takes me about an hour to build one of these frames, I think the easiest and quickest thing for me to do is just to build an entirely new frame. Sure, I could try and make the warped one work, but I think it's going to be faster for me just to build a new frame. And hey, who knows, I might find a use for this old warped one. It could be a pretty cool picture frame. I need a slightly bigger unicorn for this frame. Speaking of unicorns, and that has to be the absolute smoothest segue I have ever made. But speaking of unicorns, like I mentioned in my last video, next weekend I'm not going to be here aboard Athena, so the next video is going to be a Q&A type video. If you've got any kind of questions you'd like to pile on the list for that video, go ahead and leave them as a comment down below. Fortunately, I've still got this frame, the good frame, and it's not like having the other frame is going to slow me down. I've got plenty of stuff on my to-do list this weekend. You might have noticed that the edges here look a little rough, but that's okay. There is an easy fix. Absolutely perfect. The next thing I need to do is to round over these corners. I've got this template that I made for the first of the frames I built, the one for the huge hatch up on the foredeck. So this should be pretty easy. That's a bit of bad planning on my part. It would certainly have been easier if I had just placed that screw a little bit further in here. I think I've shown you guys these blades before. These are my absolute favorite when it comes to detailed cuts with my jigsaw. They're certainly a lot better than a more standard blade like this one. Here's a little bit of a closer look just in case you want to try these out for yourself. Fingers crossed, it would be really awesome if I didn't mess this up. Perfect. I haven't sanded this yet. It's silky smooth and there's absolutely no tear out. Those blades are freaking awesome. I know by using my big sander on a narrow surface like this, I am gonna be rounding over the edges slightly, and that's okay in this case because the top edge is gonna get a nice radius put on it anyways for me to easily lay fiberglass up on top of it, and the bottom is gonna get covered by a fillet, so it doesn't matter. It's just quicker to do it this way. This thing is really starting to come together. It's almost a shame to cover it up in fiberglass, but that is going to mean less maintenance, so that's what I'll do. Let's go ahead and see if this thing fits. It would really suck if it didn't, but yeah, that's perfect. I think this was just about where I started from when I put the mahogany frame on the plywood support for the bigger hatch. So in the interest of saving a bit of time, I'm just gonna take care of this off camera. And by that, I just mean fast forwarding a tiny bit. So here the mahogany frame is, all gooped up in thickened epoxy and lined up. To check that everything is okay, I've wrapped some masking tape around the aluminum frame to not get it all smothered in thickened epoxy, and popped it in here just to make sure that there's no warping and that it's still a nice snug fit. And yeah, this looks perfect to me. In an attempt to be just a tiny bit frugal, I've used some of the leftover thickened epoxy I'd mixed up for adhering the mahogany frame to the deck to build at least the beginning of a new frame. Here's the old warped frame, and here's the beginnings of a hopefully non-warped frame. I've checked along all of the edges and it's flat against the plywood, so I'm guessing tomorrow when I remove the screws, this is gonna be flat. Fingers crossed. It's been a while since you guys have seen my little DIY HotVac type setup in action. I've actually been avoiding running it on camera because it makes kind of an annoying sound, but I'm almost done shooting video for today, so I better get this up and running. Other than the fact that placing this mat can be a little bit fiddly, it's almost a two-man job, but other than that, I don't really have any complaints about my little setup. It's working great. As you can see, once the vacuum is formed, the silicone mat has no issue conforming to the shape of the hull. The iron in Athena's keel is fully encapsulated, and because of that and my desire not to blow up the keel, I've chosen to go with a lot lower temperature than I normally would. For all the other areas of the hull, I've been shooting for somewhere between 90 and 100 degrees Celsius. For this area, I think I'm just going to stick with 35. In case you're curious about this little setup, I'll throw a link to a PDF in the description of this video. That PDF explains the process behind this setup. Now, I don't know if what's in that PDF is true or not. I'm not a chemist, but what I can say is that the areas that I've used it on Athena's hull have remained dry ever since, so maybe there's something to it. Assuming that what's in that PDF is true, by going with a lower temperature, I won't get the hydrophilic compounds that's trapped inside the laminate drawn out, but I should still be able to dry out the laminate. And the keel didn't really have any blistering, so as long as it dries out, I'm happy. As far as the rest of the day is concerned, I think I'm gonna spend that removing tow rail. Up until now, I've just been loosening a small section of tow rail at the time, but for me to be able to really buckle down once I get back home from my little trip, I figured I might as well just go ahead and remove the whole thing. In an effort to not have gravity ruin my day, I figured it might be a good idea if I suspended the tow rail from the ceiling before removing the last of the bolts. Nothing too fancy, just a line aft and one forward. Now I'm gonna get busy removing some tow rail. So far, removing the nuts and bolts that secure the tow rail is pretty easy. There are only two that are putting up any kind of a real fight, and this one right here is one of them. See how it spins freely? And to make things just a tiny bit more annoying, of course, the nut is located inside the lugger above the chat table. I guess sometimes you're just lucky. Let's see if that will hold the nut while I turn the bolt. Nope, this is gonna be a matter for Mr. Angle Grinder. Not counting the troublemakers, this is pretty easy. Once the nut is off, it's just a matter of a light little tappy tap tap tap. And the bolt pops right up. I think I'll just deal with the easy ones today and then leave the troublemakers for tomorrow. There is a little bit of an interesting area back here. It ties into what we'll be talking about tomorrow, which is the joint between the deck and the cockpit coaming and also the cabin top. Now, for today, all I just want to do is to remove this bit of wood here so that I can get to the tow rail. Åh, for helvede i satan da også. Good morning, guys. It's Sunday morning. In a few seconds, we'll take a look at what caused that uncharacteristic swearing outburst on my part. First, let's take a look at the frame. Fingers crossed, this is gonna remain nice and flat when I undo the screws. It looks nice and flat, and there is no warping. Awesome. Of course, I still have to adhere the second layer of mahogany onto this first bit of the frame. But this is all the mahogany I've got left here down by the boat. I've got plenty of this stuff up in my storage unit, but the second layer will have to wait for another day. Before leaving the boat yesterday, I turned off the heat and the vacuum, so let's just get that going again. What caused me to swear yesterday is hiding underneath my little epoxy mixing area over here. So I better go ahead and move that off the boat. On a small side note, I'll be ordering some of the fast hardener very soon because it's starting to get too cold for me to use the slow hardener. Fortunately, the resin is the same, so I'll continue using this stuff. I'll simply just be adding the fast hardener instead, and then next summer, when the temperatures come back up, I can use the rest of the slow hardener. This is the propane locker, and this is what caused me to swear yesterday, or rather, it's how it's attached to the boat that caused me to swear yesterday. See this joint here, or rather the lack of a joint? It looks like the propane locker is glassed to the cockpit. Had it not been for the fact that I need to get access to the nuts and bolts that secure the tow rail, that might actually have been a good thing. But let's dive down and take a closer look. This big gray box here, that's the propane locker. Right here is the transom, and right over here is a bulkhead. The bolts that secure the tow rail are behind the propane locker, and as you can see, there's just no way for me to gain access to them. There's about a 10-15 centimeter gap in between the transom and the propane locker and the side of the hull, so yeah, there's no way I'm gonna fit in there. But at least fiddling around in here has given me a little bit of a clue as to how they constructed the boat. It looks an awful lot like they dropped in the cockpit and cabin top as one pre-built unit into the deck after the deck was constructed. Ha! I've used my iPhone to take a few photos behind the back of the propane locker, and it looks like there might be a small hole in that bulkhead where I can access the nuts from. This is the hull, over here is the bulkhead, and there is that small opening I mentioned. Let's see if we can find that inside the aft cabin. The hole is where that black hose is. I think it's well worth it for me to investigate whether or not I can reach the nuts from there before I start cutting out the propane locker. Yeah, I think I can reach the transom, and it also feels like I can reach all of the nuts. So this might work out. Oh, that's one down, about 5 to go. And that should be the last of the bolts behind the propane locker. So this is what Athena looks like without a tow rail. Pretty cool. And best of all, as soon as I get back from my little trip, I can get busy replacing the core in the side decks. And that was the last bit of old sealant. The last thing I want to mention in this video is that dang joint. It's causing me quite the head scratching workout. I've made a little drawing here to help explain what I'm looking at. So up here is the cabin top. That has a fiberglass lip that extends down here, and to the underside of that there's some plywood adhered, and that's the plywood you see in here. Now on top of that fiberglass lip that extends from the cabin top, that's the top skin. And then of course back here, that's just a regular foam sandwich. To be completely honest, I think I know what I have to do here. I'm just kind of slowly working my nerve up to doing it. I've been messaging Andy from Boatworks today, and he suggested extending the new top skin up over the cabin top. And I think that's what I'm going to end up doing. Of course, extending the new top skin all the way up to this radius up here involves removing the port lights. I'm not too worried about that because I put them in last year and I used butyl, so I know they'll be easy to remove. The thing I'm kind of concerned about is this plywood down here and what happens once I start sanding away all of this right here. The reason I talk about sanding away this joint here is because the plywood I've exposed here in my little exploratory section was pretty wet, and I'm guessing once I move down to the side decks, which are lower than this, well, that plywood is probably going to be pretty rotten. I think it might be a good idea to put up some supports for the cabin top down below before I start removing this joint here, because the only thing holding up the cabin top and the cockpit is this joint here. I say that because there is quite a bit of overhang here down below. The entire front section here all the way back to the Dodger is supported by nothing else than this joint here. Close to the Dodger there is a bulkhead which you might just be able to see there, and that extends all the way up to the cabin top and is glass to the cabin top, so that's going to help carry it. But forward of that there's absolutely nothing. Speaking of the Dodger, the radius that's here that I'm going to use to blend in the new fiberglass with the existing structure, well, it's kind of difficult with the Dodger in the way, so I might have to remove the Dodger. Andy thinks I might be able to get away with not doing it, but yeah, we'll see what happens. Fortunately, the trip that I've mentioned involves a quick transatlantic flight, so I've got a bit of time to just sit around and mull everything over, so that's nice. And I'm sure you guys are going to give me a bunch of good suggestions down in the comments. I better get busy rendering this video, but I'll see you next weekend for that Q&A video that I've mentioned. So yeah, I guess that's it for this weekend. As always, feel free to leave a comment down below, and don't forget, if you've enjoyed this video, remember to leave a like. See you!